Lost battles and revolts, that was the Janissaries' achievements from 1600 to 1800. This could not go on for longer. Something had to be done, but this proved to be a difficult task. There were attempts to reform the Janissaries. Köprülü Mehmed tried to make them irrelevant through the introduction of his own bodyguard in 1656. Köprülü Hüseyin halved the Janissaries' numbers and tried to give them new training until he was sacked in 1702. Mahmud I hired Claude Alexandre Comte de Bourneval to reform his armies along European lines. The French diplomat of Hungarian origins, François Baron de Tott, had the task to reform the Ottoman artillery corps around 1770. Nevertheless, he was also enlisted as a Janissary like up to 500,000 other people. On the 6th of April 1789, Selim III ascended to the throne during a time of real danger for the empire. By the time of Selim's accession, the Russians had captured the great Dniester force of Akkerman, Bender and Kozim, overrun Bessarabia and invaded Moldavia. Within a few months, the Allies routed his army at Fokshani and again on the Rymnik and took Belgrade, and Serbia and Bosnia were in danger of occupation by the Austrians. It seemed that nothing remained to save the rest of the empire in Europe, including Istanbul itself. Austria and Russia advancing. Rumblings for independence in Greece. The situation looked dire for the Ottomans when the Prussians came to the rescue. After the death of the Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II, the Austrians under his successor Leopold II had a standoff with the Prussians concerning the partition of Poland, and it nearly came to a war in 1791. Finally a solution was found that included the Peace of Sistova with the Ottomans, who were allies of the Prussians. Selim III could now concentrate on the Russians, and with Prussian mediation reached a treaty with Catherine the Great, which was signed in 1792 in Jassy. In this terrible situation, the Ottomans were lucky that the enemies of its enemies were stronger than themselves. But there was no guarantee that this would remain like this. Reforms had to be achieved somehow. In the end, the only military branch which experienced some reforms was the artillery, but the Janissaries outright refused. During the war, Selim had made efforts to get the Janissaries to accept new weapons and tactics from Western Europe, but they had staunchly resisted, since the very positions in Ottoman society, as well as that of the supporters among the ruling classes in Istanbul, depended on a monopoly of the old ways, which the reforms were designed to replace. While these troops were no longer able to defeat foreign enemies, they still had enough power at home to protect their interests. At this point, the logic was clear. If the army refused reforms, a new army had to be created, and so did Selim III by establishing the Nizam-I Cedid, which means new order, which, just like Def Shemi, reminds me very much of Star Wars. The nucleus of this new order is strange, because its first personnel were nothing more than the jesters of a pasha. In late 1791, the Grand Vizier Kocha Yusuf Pasha, still in the field against the Russians, assembled in his camp a small number of renegades captured in the course of the campaign. These renegades, in cooperation with a few members of the Grand Vizier's personal guard, began to train with captured Russian weapons, using European-style exercises and maneuvers, and they performed periodically in front of the master's tent as a kind of entertainment in order to divert the army's leaders from their increasingly difficult military problems. Selim made his decision when he witnessed such a show. The former soldiers who now were jesters became soldiers again. The British ambassador provided some muskets and bayonets, and around 100 Turks were recruited from the streets and sent to Levant, a little bit north of Istanbul, overlooking Besiktas, were usually artillery trained. 4 French officers came in as support. All of this happened secretly, but when the plan eventually reached the Sultan's council, one issue became very difficult to solve: how to finance this new army. Finally, on the 14th of May 1792, a compromise was reached. A new army was to be created under the name Nizam-I Cedid. To provide for its expenses, a new treasury would be organized to administer whatever revenues were assigned to it. But to appease the vested interests, both the new army and its treasury were clothed in the garb of established institutions in the Ottoman system. Finally, they decided to give the new revenue as its main source of income all the tax farms of the treasury, together with those belonging to the Holy City foundations. To lighten the effect of the loss of these revenues on the imperial treasury and its tax farmers, the Sultan also decreed that this transfer should take place only when the holdings in question were vacated by the current farmers. In essence, thus, the treasury of the new revenue itself became the tax farmer of these holdings for the imperial treasury, administering them and collecting the taxes by sub-farming them to its own tax farmers. With rivals from France, Britain and Sweden, the new order expanded. 2 years after this, the Sultan went public about their existence. Officially, the new order was part of the Bostanci Corps, a Janissary unit, but actually everything about the new order was, well, new. They got new barracks in 1796 across the Bosporus in Scutari and Kadıköy, and in 1806 another base in Edirne. In addition, they got new uniforms with blue berets, red breeches and red jackets. But they also got discipline. The men were required to remain in the barracks night and day, to forgo all outside employment and residence, and to drill constantly, except that arrangements were made for 1 out of every 5 men to return to his family for periods up to 6 months during the winter. Heavy punishments were established for those who returned late from such leave, and for all members of such groups of 5, of whom more than 1 man was absent at a given time. Officers were not allowed for the first time to marry, although the men were supposed to remain single so they could be subjected to the severe discipline of the corps. But those men already in the corps who had married were not required to divorce their wives. Actually, this kind of discipline is not new. It seems to be a return to the old regulations of the Janissaries, when they still were a respectable fighting force. As the new corps got more and more tax farms assigned, the troops expanded too. In 1799 a new regiment was added. Men for the new regiment were provided by the provincial governors, who were ordered to recruit men locally and train them in the Nizam-I Cedid way, under the direction of officers sent from the Levant Tiflik. And the expansion continued. Starting in 1802, the colonel developed a system of military conscription throughout Anatolia to provide regular contingents of men to the new order. Each provincial and district official and notable was required to send a certain number of men for training in the new army for periods of from 6 months to a year. About half of these contingents were trained as infantry for service in the regular regiments. The other half were trained as cavalry so that they could return to form the local militias of the provincial governors and district notables. Men had to remain in the corps at least 3 years so that the state would benefit from the training given them. After that time they could leave and return to the former occupation if they wished, but only if they agreed to pay back all the salaries they had received since entering the corps. Through this, the corps reached a total of 20,685 enlisted men and 1,590 officers in 1806. As one can imagine, it did not take long till they were corrupted too. The rapid increase in the number of men enrolled in the Nizam-I Cedid created new problems, in particular the same sort of disorderly, undisciplined behavior that had brought the older corps into disrepute. Many of the soldiers joined more for the weapons and plunder they could gain than for anything else. Resistant to the discipline and accustomed to the kind of life required by the corps, they became increasingly turbulent and disorderly, often coming down from Levant Tiflik to ravage the villages along the Bosporus. Many of the men fled from the camp shortly after they received their uniforms and weapons, complaining that the work was too hard, the discipline too severe and the pay too low. Forming themselves into powerful new robber bands, they began to plague notables and governors alike in Western Anatolia and the Balkans, with the superior weapons and training provided by the Sultan, giving them a greater advantage over their opponents. Some 100 soldiers saw action against the French in 1799, especially at the blockade of Rosetta, together with the British. Others fought rebel bands in Thrace and Macedonia, but the real deployment became almost impossible. And so ended the first serious attempt to replace the Janissaries. It added another 2 days of plundering, the heads of many powerful officials, and the blood of another sultan to the Janissaries' achievements. The opposition to the new core climaxed in 1806, when internal revolts broke out and a new Russian invasion led to scarcity and famine. The anger was easily directed at the new order, which drew more and more resources from the treasury. In the spring of 1807, when an effort to reform the Janissary auxiliaries stationed at the Bosporus Force led to a new conservative rising in Istanbul, Selim responded not by using the new army to suppress it, but by dissolving the new order, dispersing its men and dismissing the reformers from his government. In the end, even this did not satisfy the rebels, who went on to replace him with his cousin Mustafa IV and to kill all the new order men they could find. The pattern of the rebellion was a familiar one. The Janissary parade ground seethed with Janissaries and men belonging to the armorers' corps and the militia. The cauldrons in which the Janissaries' food was cooked were brought out onto the square and overturned, the customary gesture of defiance against the Sultan. Deliberations inside the barracks had produced a list of 12 high-ranking officials whom the rebels held responsible for the grievances, and some of them marched to the hippodrome to demand that these men be handed over, on the way murdering a clerk of the Janissary Corps who was foolhardily enough to suggest moderation. The Janissary leaders tried to calm the mob, but they wanted to get their hands on the officials on the list, have the new order dissolved and all traces of it expunged. Fearfully, Sultan Selim agreed to comply with this demand, promising a return to the system of Sultan's infantry and cavalry which had prevailed in the days of Sultan Selim I. When rumors of the imminent disbandment of the new order reached the barracks, Selim's cherished troops simply left their posts and wandered off. Some of the government officers whose names were on the rebels' lists were discovered in hiding, taken to the Janissary parade ground and murdered, and the Sultan, in a bid to save himself, had others executed in a palace and the heads sent out to the Janissaries. But it was not over yet. There were loyalists left, and one of them, Alemdar Mustafa Pasha, also known as Bayraktar Mustafa Pasha, the standard-bearer, then marched on Istanbul. When Bayraktar Mustafa heard news that Grand Vizier Celebi Mustafa Pasha had invited rival Danubian notables to meet him in Edirne as he returned from campaign, he marched towards the city with 10,000 men in a display of strength, which struck fear into the population not just there but in Istanbul. It should be noted that the Pasha decided to march the best of his soldiers from the front during a war against the Russians. Alemdar Mustafa Pasha acted promptly. He arrested the Grand Vizier and unfurled the sacred standard of the Prophet, which he had carried on campaign and presciently brought back with him. The few Janissaries offered no resistance. Mustafa IV's life now was in real danger. There was only one solution left. Selim was strong, and when surprised in his mother's apartment, put up a valiant fight against unequal odds, until he was stabbed in the heart. A lawless and sacrilegious act, since the Sultan's blood might not be shed. Selim's death secured Mustafa's own life, since there were hardly any heirs to the Ottoman dynasty left. When Bayraktar Mustafa entered the palace, he found he was too late. He asked the new Shaykhul Islam whether Sultan Mustafa, murderer of an innocent, could any longer be considered the legitimate ruler. Now Mustafa had to pay the price that he was not thorough enough in cleaning up his family. He had not managed to lay hand on his only remaining brother Mahmud, and this gave Bayraktar Mustafa some leverage. Receiving the answer he anticipated, he had Mustafa's brother Mahmud brought from his quarters. Bayraktar Mustafa and all the senior statesmen swore allegiance to the new Sultan Mahmud II, who offered Bayraktar Mustafa the Grand Vizier's seal. After initially demurring, he accepted the honor. With Mahmud II enthroned on 28th July, the reforms were back in charge again. Bayraktar Mustafa did some torturing and murdering of his rivals, and everything turned out perfectly. Or did it? On 14th November 1808, Bayraktar's men were attacked without warning when 6,000 Janissaries marched on the Sarai in order to restore the creature Mustafa IV. Alemdar and a small bodyguard were driven back into a fortified tower of the palace. There, history repeated itself, when Alemdar flung the corpse of Mustafa IV at the feet of his foes. Mahmud II managed to do what Mustafa IV failed to do. He now was the last member of the Ottoman dynasty and thereby beyond sacrosanct. Alemdar Mustafa Pasha then retreated to the palace of the Grand Vizier opposite the Alai kiosk, which the mutineers immediately surrounded. Alemdar saw that all was lost. To escape the horrors of capture, he blew up the powder magazine, killing himself, many of his own men, and 300 Janissaries. About 300 men of the new army had taken refuge in the barracks at Sultan Ahmed. They fired on the Janissaries in a desperate resistance, which ended when barracks and neighborhood were attacked by flames. Even in the countryside, the disbanded soldiers of the new army were slaughtered. Something like Selim's reforms could not happen again. The Janissaries and the religious establishment were unified in this conclusion. To ensure that future Ottoman leaders refrained from similar reform efforts, the Janissaries convinced the state's religious authorities to issue an opinion declaring that the suggested military reforms were incompatible with religious law. And this is a good place to stop and take a look at what we learned today. Let's recapitulate Selim's experiment. Through a nearly ridiculous incident, he saw an example of Western troops when one of his pashas had his captives present European drill. Since in this time the Sultan's army nearly always lost against the Europeans, Selim III decided to copy them. Janissaries and reforms did not fit together very well, so Selim and his advisors decided to establish a new corps. They called it Nizam-I Cedid, the New Order. They generated the necessary fundings by assigning more and more tax farms to the benefit of the new army. In the end, this meant that influential people among the many Janissaries lost their benefices. Furthermore, the new soldiers did not gain long-term employment in the new corps, but were sent back to the provinces after some years. This led to trained and well-equipped robber bands. The rebellion of 1807 can be evaluated within the context of internal power strife between different power groups that competed for power within the establishment of the Ottoman administration. The majority of sources agree on the new order grandee's lavish and corrupt image, which assumedly helped the rebels to gain support of the public. The rebels organized themselves in a collective manner and decisions were made after much deliberation. The prudence to maintain the peace and order in the city was one of the key elements of winning the public. Naturally, the Janissaries as well as the populace became more and more distrustful towards the new comrades. Finally, the Janissaries got new uniforms of European style. This was the spark that ignited the power keg. The Janissaries refused and demanded the abolishment of the new troops instead. Sultan Selim III did not have the nerves to stand up to their pressure and deploy his new army against them. He caved in. This cost some lives. First, those of some high-ranking officials, and finally that of Selim himself, who was succeeded by Mustafa IV on the 29th of May 1807. Mustafa did only survive a little bit more than 1 year. On the 28th of July 1808, Bayraktar Alemdar Mustafa dethroned him and put Mahmud II in his place. After another revolt in which the Bayraktar himself died, Mustafa IV was killed on the 15th of November 1808, leaving Mahmud II as the sole Ottoman claimant. And now it is your turn again. Can you think of a method that would have been more successful than Selim's attempt to reform the Janissaries? Tell me in the comments. Please do not forget to like, share and subscribe. So long, we'll meet again soon. Stay critical, stay curious, stay free.